Imagine this, it's World War II, but instead of Japan attacking the USA, they set their sights on the USSR. How might history have unfolded? To appreciate the weight of this question, we first need to understand the historical context. As we know, during the Second World War, Japan was a formidable force in the Pacific. They had their eyes set on establishing a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an economic and political bloc that would make them a dominant power in the region. Meanwhile, the USA, although neutral initially, was leaning towards the Allies, supplying them with crucial resources. This was a thorn in Japan's side, as these resources were bolstering their enemies. The USSR, on the other hand, had a neutrality pact with Japan. The Soviets were busy on the Western Front, combating Nazi Germany, and the last thing they needed was another front opening in the East. Now, why did Japan choose to attack the USA in reality? Well, the answer lies in America's embargo on Japan. The embargo, a response to Japan's invasion of China, cut off vital supplies, including oil, crippling Japan's war efforts. This pushed Japan into a corner, and they felt that the only way out was to neutralize the American Pacific Fleet, which led to the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. But what if, in our hypothetical scenario, Japan hadn't been cornered this way? What if, instead, they had seen an opportunity in the USSR's preoccupation with Germany? What if they had decided to break their neutrality pact and attack the Soviets, hoping to seize territory and resources in Siberia and the Far East? The potential implications of this alternate course of action are vast and intriguing. Would the USSR have been able to fight a war on two fronts? How would the USA have reacted to Japan's aggression being directed elsewhere? Would the course of the war, and indeed the course of world history, have taken a drastically different path? But let's not dwell on what actually happened. Instead, let's dive into this alternate timeline and explore how events might have transpired. So the year is 1941 and Japan has launched a surprise attack on the USSR instead of Pearl Harbor. Imagine the shockwaves rippling across the globe as news of this unexpected assault breaks. Japan, a nation with imperial ambitions, has turned its sights on the Soviet Union, a formidable adversary with a vast, battle-hardened military. In this scenario, the initial attack would likely target the USSR's Eastern Front, a region less fortified than its Western counterpart. Given the strategic nature of surprise attacks, Japan could have achieved an initial upper hand. However, it's worth noting that the Soviet Union, despite being embroiled in a brutal war with Nazi Germany, had a military strength that was not to be underestimated. The Soviet Union's Red Army was one of the largest and most experienced fighting forces of the time. Despite the potential for initial Japanese successes, a sustained invasion would have been a Herculean task. The Soviet Union's harsh winters, vast landscapes, and resilient people had proven to be formidable defensive assets in past conflicts. Now let's consider the potential global reactions. The USA, having been spared the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, would find itself in a complex situation. Without the direct provocation of Pearl Harbor, the American public might have been less inclined to support a full-scale entry into the war. Yet the USA had vested interests in both the Pacific and European theaters, so a Japanese attack on the USSR could have accelerated American involvement in other ways. On the other side of the world, European nations would likely have watched this new Asian front with a mix of apprehension and intrigue. The shift of Japan's focus to the USSR could have potentially eased pressure on the Allies in the Pacific, allowing them to concentrate their resources on the war in Europe. This unexpected attack would certainly have shocked the world, setting the stage for a very different World War II. As the war progresses, the USSR finds itself fighting on two major fronts, against Germany in the west and Japan in the east. Now, imagine the complexity of this scenario. An already beleaguered Soviet Union, grappling with the might of the German army, now also has to divert resources and manpower to counteract the Japanese forces in the east. This two-front war would have undoubtedly strained the USSR's war strategy and resources. The Soviet army, known for its resilience and tenacity, would now have to split its focus, diminishing its strength on both fronts. The Soviet Union's industrial power, a key factor in its ability to keep up with the demands of the war, would have been stretched to its limits. Now let's turn our eyes to the Eastern Front. The vast Siberian landscape, harsh weather conditions, and logistical challenges would have presented the Japanese with a formidable challenge. However, the Soviets, now forced to split their forces, would be significantly less equipped to exploit these advantages. And then, there's the Battle of Stalingrad, a turning point in World War II. The relentless German assault had already drained much of the Soviet Union's resources. Now, with a simultaneous Japanese attack, the Soviets would have been hard-pressed to hold their ground. The battle, which in our timeline resulted in a pivotal Soviet victory, might have swung in favor of the Axis powers under these circumstances. The impact of a two-front war would have been felt not just on the battlefield, but also on the home front. The Soviet people, already enduring hardships, would have been burdened further, affecting morale and potentially leading to internal strife. The USSR, now stretched thin, would face significant challenges, potentially altering the course of the war. The outcome of this hypothetical scenario, well, that's a story for another time, but one thing's for sure, the map of the world could have looked very different today. In this alternate timeline, the USA hasn't been directly attacked. Would they still have entered the war? This question is intriguing and opens up a myriad of possibilities. One potential reason for the United States to join the war could be their existing alliances. Even without a direct attack, the USA was far from neutral. The US had strong alliances with Britain and China, both of whom were under Axis threat. If Japan had attacked the Soviet Union instead, the USA might have still stepped in to support their allies and maintain the global balance of power. The threat of Axis expansion could be another compelling reason. Remember, the US was not just a country, but a global power. The growth of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, could have threatened the USA's global influence. The United States might have seen Axis expansion as a direct threat to their own national security. But it's not just about why the USA might have joined the war, but also how their involvement might have differed. Without the provocation of Pearl Harbor, the USA's entry into the war might have been less immediate, less decisive. It's possible that they would have initially focused more on economic and logistical support to their allies, rather than committing troops. However, as the war progressed and the Axis powers continued to expand, the USA might have been forced to take a more active military role. This could have led to a more gradual but no less significant engagement in the conflict. It's also important to consider the American public sentiment. Without a direct attack on American soil, public support for the war might have been lower, potentially affecting the USA's willingness to commit resources and manpower. Without a direct attack, the USA's involvement in the war would likely be very different, adding another layer of complexity to this alternate timeline. It's a fascinating thought experiment, one that underscores the intricate web of alliances, power dynamics, and national interests that shaped World War II. With the war finally over, how would this alternate timeline have shaped the post-war world? Let's imagine it together. The end of the war would likely have resulted in a different division of territories. Perhaps Japan, having focused its energies on the USSR, might have secured more territories in Asia. This could have led to a different balance of power in the region, with Japan potentially emerging as a stronger regional force. This shift in power dynamics could have had a significant impact on the onset of the Cold War. With Japan and the USSR having been major combatants, the USA might not have emerged as the dominant Western power it became in our timeline. The Cold War, if it occurred at all, might have been a three-way standoff, with Japan, the USA, and the USSR each vying for influence. The relationships between these three nations could have been vastly different. The USA and Japan might have formed a closer alliance, united by their opposition to the USSR. On the other hand, the USSR, having borne the brunt of Japan's aggression, might have been more isolated and defensive. The aftermath of this alternate World War II would also likely have seen a different economic landscape. The USA, having been less directly involved in the war, might have emerged even stronger economically. Japan, despite potential territorial gains, might have faced a more challenging post-war recovery due to the toll taken by the war against the USSR. And let's not forget about the cultural implications. The cultural exchange and influence that we see today between the USA and Japan might have taken a different form, influenced by their shared wartime experiences. In this alternate timeline, the aftermath of World War II would have been vastly different, potentially reshaping the world as we know it today. So there you have it, an exploration into an alternate World War II where Japan attacked the USSR instead of the USA. The ripples from this single change could have dramatically altered the course of history, but as we know, history is full of what-ifs. Until next time, keep imagining, keep questioning, and keep exploring the fascinating world of alternate history.